Hey, well, good morning, and thank you for joining us for the November presentation in the speaker series, Toxicology and Societies, the Impacts of Chemicals in Our Lives. I'm Tracy Collier, a toxicologist, and I spent most of my career at NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center. My co-host is Ruth Sofield in environmental toxicology. Hey, Ruth, how are you doing?
Hey there, Tracy.
Environmental toxicology, you're ruining my script, and chemistry professor at Western Washington University. And as we introduced to you last month, Ian Moran is joining us and hosting this series. Hey, Ian. Ian's a visiting assistant professor at Western in environmental toxicology as well. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we at Western Washington University are on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join in expressing our deep respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. Now, a few logistics. We will save questions for the end of the presentation, but you can use the Q&A feature on your screen at any time. You'll be muted throughout the presentation, so we will use the Q&A feature for interacting. You should have different viewing options in Zoom, and we suggest you use the speaker view so that you can see the speaker and the presentation at the same time. The focus of our speaker series is to provide understandable examples of how events with a toxicological component have consequences to people and societies. Today, we are really happy to welcome Abigail Bline as our speaker. Dr. Bline received her PhD in molecular toxicology from UCLA and currently is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Silent Spring Institute in Northeastern University. When you have a chance, I recommend that you make sure to visit the website for the Silent Spring Institute. It's really nice. Good work. Her research focuses on biological mechanisms underlying health effects from PFAS, and other environmental toxicants, and translating this information into action that promotes public health. Welcome, Abigail, and thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll let you take it away from here.
Great. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm very excited to be here, and thanks to everyone who joined us today on this webinar. I'm excited to share what I have with you. I'm going to pull up my screen, and hopefully I am in presenting mode so everyone can see my presenting slides. If that's not the case, please let me know.
You look good.
Excellent. Thank you. And just before I get started talking about this regulatory toxicology and how it affects you, I just want to mention that I am supported by an NIH training grant, but I have no financial conflicts of interest to declare. So getting started, we walk into grocery stores, into hardware stores, into drugstores, and the shelves are lined with products, endless products, and you may not think about it much, but all of these products have various chemicals in them, either in the products themselves or in the packaging that's used to contain the products. And you may not think about it too much either, but there is a process that's involved in getting these products onto the shelf that determines how they get there. And you may assume that that process results in chemicals having an assumed or known certainty of safety. And I'm going to talk today about how that system doesn't necessarily guarantee that in the way that we might think. I'll go into a little bit the types of tests that are used to determine safety when they are used, as well as some tips and pointers for how you might yourself reduce your own exposures to chemicals that might present a health risk, as well as what you can do to try to reduce exposures for everyone. So I'm going to start a little bit with just talking about the actual laws and regulatory systems surrounding chemicals in the US, starting with some major laws that essentially determine how chemicals are regulated in the US. Starting in 1938, going all the way back there, when the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was first passed. This was originally focused on a lot having to do with adulteration of products and assuring that labeling or the products didn't contain things that they didn't claim to be, essentially. There have been a lot of amendments to this act over the years. One of the most relevant ones to my talk today is in 1997 with the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act, which in this case actually made the restrictions or rules for approving chemicals less strict. Oftentimes we think of the progression of more strict regulation, but in this case, it made some changes that allowed for chemicals onto the market with less restrictions, which I'll go into later. But ultimately, the rules and regulations under this act are administered by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Additional regulation, law was passed in 1947 called FIFRA, which essentially was focused mainly on pesticides. And this, once again, has been amended multiple times. But in 1972, essentially, the major change here was that the authority for implementing rules and regulations under FIFRA was transferred from the Agricultural Department to the EPA, which implements the law today. And then the final major law is TSCA. So this was passed in 1976 and essentially captures a broad range of chemicals often referred to as industrial chemicals. And this was recently amended, or relatively recently amended, in 2016 in attempts to essentially provide more authority for EPA to request information from manufacturers, as well as deal with chemicals that have been on the market for a while. And again, I'll get into this a little bit more later on. But essentially, there are kind of different ways that the laws are set out for how safety is determined, or what it even kind of means to be safe, or what products are supposed to adhere to for standards for relative to protecting human health. And under the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, which regulates or has authority over pharmaceuticals, food additives, food contact substances, which is essentially a subset of food additives, and cosmetics. The majority of the language that you see here is that the products need to be safe. And so the focus is on safety for humans, which makes sense because these are products that are, intentionally going into our bodies in the case of pharmaceutical and foods, or directly onto our bodies for cosmetics. One note about cosmetics is that this actual language relative to safety, or in this case being not injurious to users, was not added until December of last year. And the law is regulations are still being implemented for this. So this is actually a relatively new requirement for cosmetics, and that wasn't in place before. And then in terms of pesticides, it's a little bit different under FIFRA. So the policy is not causing unreasonable adverse effects to the environment, although adverse effects to the environment is defined also to include humans. So a broader looking at effects on the environment, but and human health, but this not the use of the word safety specifically. And similar for industrial chemicals under TSCA, it's this risk-based language, not presenting an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment again. So just starting here, you can see that different chemicals kind of have different standards for what safety should be, just based upon the tone of the law. And then when you go into the actual regulations, which are based upon what the law allows or dictates, but also there's a lot of leeway for regulators to interpret how to implement that law, you'll find that for pharmaceuticals and pesticides, there are nearly absolute requirements for toxicity testing to assess potential effects for human health. That's essentially always required for product registration for new chemicals in these classes to be allowed into the market. This is not really the case for several other classes of chemicals. So there's no absolute toxicity testing requirement for product registration for food additives, food contact substances, cosmetics, or industrial chemicals. And we will get a little bit more into that later on, what that ends up meaning. But essentially, there's this partition just based upon chemical class as to whether there's even data required in the first place when a chemical is first put onto the market. Furthermore, there are different exemptions based upon the law and the regulations as to chemicals that don't need to even be registered with the agencies in the first place. So in the context of food additives, there's this term called generally recognized as safe, and the requirements for classifying an ingredient as generally recognized as safe are not what I would call stringent. There aren't specific data requirements. It's more based upon informed scientific opinion and past experience. So if a substance has been used for a long time, then it's kind of generally recognized as safe, basically. And then in the context of food contact substances, the exemption is based upon how much of the substance is expected to migrate from the food contact material. So when I'm talking about food contact substances, this can be like food packaging, but also the processing equipment that's used when we're kind of manufacturing more modern types of foods. So if there's equipment that the food's coming into contact with, that includes any chemicals that might be used for maintaining that equipment as well. So yeah, the exemption from having to provide information on a food contact substance is based upon, this less than a certain quantity getting into a person's diet each day. Pesticides do have some exemptions from registration as well when they're being used in pesticide-treated materials, such as like pressure-treated wood with chemicals added to it, also as well as under certain emergency use scenarios for disease outbreaks or pest outbreaks. There's some rules for that. And also when chemicals are being sold for export and not being sold in the US. And there's for industrial chemicals, there are limits based upon the quantity produced. So if chemicals are going to be produced under a certain volume or imported under a certain volume, then they don't fall under these registration requirements. Similarly, if they're sold for export. And then there's another issue with industrial chemical exemptions, which is they, under the definition of what a chemical is, it does not include chemical mixtures, chemical byproducts, or impurities. So if you're producing a chemical and in that process, it generates some other chemical that is likely to be either in your final product or might end up in your waste stream as a process of manufacturing that chemical, it's not regulated and you don't have to register it. So yeah, there are definitely, in addition to just the toxicity testing lack of toxicity testing requirements, in many cases, there are also exemptions from registration altogether. And then we have different rules as well for chemicals that aren't new, that aren't being registered for the first time. And basically under most of the laws, there's provisions for grandfathering. So this is when chemicals were in use prior to the laws being enacted, or either laws being passed or the regulations pertaining to the specific chemicals existing. They're essentially allowed to continue in production as they were before the law was passed. Depending upon the law, and the type of chemical, there are provisions for reviewing these kind of existing grandfathered chemicals, or even ones that were registered a long time ago periodically. But this is, there are practicality difficulties with this. There's thousands of chemicals that have been registered, and the ability of like the funding and staffing ability of the regulatory agencies is limited. So the actual reality of being able to thoroughly re-review all of these chemicals regularly is just not really, not really practical. And then there are some legal or regulatory barriers in some contexts for being able to enforce modern standards for old chemicals. For instance, FDA doesn't have authority to require producers of food contact materials to provide their own testing data, one for existing chemicals. So this is a problem because a lot of the time the manufacturers are the ones who are producing the data on their chemicals. So they're the ones who hold that, and it's often not published. It's maintained with the company unless they have to submit it. So if the regulatory agency doesn't have authority to get that information, then there's not much they can do to really evaluate the chemical unless there are independent data that have been produced by other researchers. So yeah, there's more limitations here for older chemicals. Okay, so now that we've kind of covered the general status with a very brief overview of the laws and regulations pertaining to chemicals in the US, what is the situation? What is the result of this system? So focusing specifically on industrial chemicals under TSCA, there are currently 40,000 or approximately 40,000 chemicals that are registered. This includes 30,000 chemicals that are publicly identified, in addition to another 10,000 chemicals or so that are protected under the confidential business information, CBI rule, or it's part of the law as well, but basically companies don't necessarily have to allow for their chemical, even the chemical identity to be revealed to the public if it's protected confidential business information that they feel is important to marketing their product. In any case, so of these 40,000 chemicals, between 1979 and 2016, only about 15% of them were registered with any health or safety data. So basically the companies submitting the registration pre-manufacturer notice for the chemical, it didn't contain any data related to human health or safety. And EPA did require restrictions or more testing data for about 10% of these before 2016, but during this time, there have been some changes since the 2016 Lautenberg Act to change this, but essentially EPA, in order to request more information from a registrant, essentially had to have a reason to expect that there might be a reason why there'd be unreasonable risk of health and safety to request the data. But if they don't have the data, it'd be hard to know that. And then also the process for implementing any type of restrictions on the use of the chemicals was fairly burdensome. So it was difficult for EPA to even put in place restrictions for chemicals that either didn't have enough data or had data indicating that they were likely to present an unreasonable risk to health. So essentially, this means that roughly 34,000 chemicals that are in commerce, or at least that are registered under TSCA, have essentially no safety data, or at least nothing that was provided at the time of product registration. We have a somewhat similar situation for food contact chemicals, which are under the, once again, going back to the FDA, there are over 1,600 food contact substances that are currently listed on the FDA database. And previously, there was a registration process that was required under the FFDCA, but that was changed in 1997 under the Modernization Act, such that basically it's kind of a notification of sorts, but essentially the FDA, the substance is automatically allowed to go into use as a food contact substance if the FDA doesn't object actively within 120 days. So that means essentially if either the EPA didn't, or excuse me, the FDA didn't get around to reviewing the chemical, or for whatever other reason didn't file any type of objection, then essentially the chemical was by default allowed to be used. And between 2001 and 2010, of the over 900 chemicals that were filed through the system, or at least filed with FDA, only 2 of them were rejected on grounds for concerns for toxicological impacts. So this kind of shows a parallel with TSCA. Essentially, there are the majority of chemicals that have very minimal data that are in use. And I just wanted to touch upon PFAS a little bit, just since that is my area of expertise, and I think provides a good example of just how big the problem is. So per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, are a group of over 10,000 chemicals, depending upon how you define them. They were first commercialized in the 1940s. So this is, well before TSCA existed, the law that would govern them. And they've been used for many purposes in industrial and consumer products alike, including in pesticides and pesticide formulations, in water and stain-resistant fabrics, and in food packaging materials, among other uses. And over time, many independent studies and government agency assessments have found that certain PFAS are likely to cause a range of negative health effects, including immune effects, effects on the liver, likely risk for cancer, certain types of cancers, among various other effects. And there are thousands of PFAS that are in use. And, aside from the ones that have been studied more, there are many others that haven't been studied and have no toxicity data, essentially, or at least not publicly. But even so, PFAS haven't been formally restricted in the US. Essentially, there were some voluntary agreements that were put in place between EPA and certain manufacturers of PFOA and PFOS, which are the most studied chemicals and found to have, the strongest evidence for links with health effects. Those were phased out voluntarily in the early 2000s. And more recently, there was a voluntary phase out agreement between EPA and certain food package manufacturers who were using a certain fluoral telomere, in food packaging, and they have agreed to phase that out by the end of 2020, by the end of this year. But there are no formal restrictions on any of them. EPA does have some proposed actions that they're planned under the PFAS roadmap strategy, I believe. I might be saying that incorrectly, but they do have a plan in place to try to continue to implement actions that might either potentially restrict or require more information for more PFAS going forward. But that is a slow process, and they have only done that. They've only requested more information for 2 PFAS so far out of around 600, I believe, that they identified as potentially needing more data. So we have, once again, all those thousands of existing chemicals that are already registered and already in use without good data. And then on top of that, we have hundreds of new chemicals, and this is just under TSCA, that are being registered and entering into commerce each year. So essentially, it's already a large problem. And then on top of that, it's only increasing in the number of chemicals each year. So as I mentioned, a lot of these chemicals don't have toxicity data, which is concerning. But when I'm talking about toxicity data and what it can provide and what might be useful about it, what am I even talking about? I've been using the term a lot, but I haven't really described what that means. So I just briefly wanted to touch upon what, at least in the regulatory context, what the common types of toxicity tests are, and what the information is that they might provide that could help inform decision making. So obviously, humans are complex organisms. We have many different organ systems that are connected with one another in various ways, communicate with one another, but at the same time have their own tissue-specific cell types and ways of reacting to chemical substances. So there are, a lot of different targets in the body, and a lot of different ways that chemicals can interact and potentially cause negative health effects through those different body systems. At the same time, it's kind of impossible to test for everything conceivable that could happen for a single chemical all at once. So what's often used for, and what's allowed under EPA and FDA rules is what's called a tiered testing approach. So because you can't test for everything all at once, and maybe that's that might be unnecessary because maybe your chemical is not that toxic, so you don't need to do that all at once. Essentially, you start out with tier 1 tests. So these are essentially usually pretty basic tests trying to identify what's called acute toxicity, which I'll get into on the next slide, and trying to find major effects on different organ systems. And if there are no effects, and it takes a lot of chemical to kill an animal, then and the chemical is considered to have low toxicity, then it'll get shunted off, indicating that it needs no further testing. But if there are effects, if it can cause effects, especially at lower doses, if it kills very readily, and if there are particular organs that appear to be targeted in certain ways, it might go on to, or it would then go on to higher levels of testing. So tier 2, tier 3 tests, and it kind of proceeds in this fashion where if a previous test or set of tests indicates effects and likelihood to need to do more tests, then that's done in that stepwise fashion until essentially, hopefully, the chemical is well evaluated, essentially, in an ideal situation. And there are, benefits to this in terms of reducing the time it takes to evaluate a chemical and the financial costs, as well as the number of experimental animals used. So most of these basic toxicity tests or standard toxicity tests that are done do use mammals, either rodents, but also rabbits, dogs, sometimes monkeys, especially for pharmaceuticals. But basically, if you minimize the number of tests that you're doing, then you're minimizing the number of animals that you're using and having to subject to these tests, and which is part of a goal under EPA for reduction and refinement in animal testing to minimize the number of animals used. At the same time, tier testing does have limitations because you're not looking for everything at once. Not that you necessarily can, but if your initial tests don't indicate any effects, you think, okay, I don't need to go on to further testing. But it might be partly that those lower tier tests that you're using aren't really designed to capture certain effects or under certain exposure scenarios. So I'm just going to go a little bit in. Oops, nope. Sorry, messed up my flow. That was my bad. And essentially, so I'll get into the tests on the next slide, the types of tests, but just kind of in the context, once again, into the chemical regulatory process and in the process of assessing risk, these toxicity tests are used for what's called hazard identification, which is essentially, what hazards exist. The hazard is basically anything that can happen, or any health effects that can happen in response to a chemical exposure. And dose response assessment is also part of the risk assessment to try to determine if there is a dose above which harms occur and below which they're not likely to occur. And this dose response assessment is typically assumes that chemicals do have more effects at higher concentrations and fewer effects at lower concentrations, but this is not always the case for all systems. So there sometimes is problems there, but essentially when you have the information on what effects can occur and at what concentrations they're likely to occur in animals, and extrapolate, use protective factors essentially to assume to try to build an uncertainty factor to try to essentially build in a little bit more safety for what likely concentrations are going to be harmful to humans. Then you combine this dose and hazard information with an exposure assessment. So what is the likely exposure scenario under which people are going to encounter these chemicals? Is it going to be through occupational exposures? Is it going to be through pesticide drift for pesticides? Is it what is the likelihood for how people are going to come into contact or be exposed to the chemical, and what are the likely concentrations that they'll be exposed to the chemical? And then you combine that information to kind of essentially come up with your risk characterization, which the risk is how likely is the hazard to occur given the exposure. And based upon that likelihood of health effects occurring, then you can make risk management decisions as to if it's important to impose restrictions on the chemical in certain ways, or if it's okay to be used in unrestricted ways. So going back to the types of tests that are commonly used to inform these decisions, we kind of have a range of types of tests, and typically starts with what are called acute tests. And these are often part of the tier 1 testing tests. And acute tests are short term, so they might only be a couple of days or maybe shorter. They use one dose. They generally administer one dose to the animal, so it's a single time that they're exposed, and then they're allowed to be exposed for a certain amount of time and then check the result. And usually this is also included with range finding, so looking at a range of different concentrations to try to identify, especially one of the main endpoints that's looked for here is death. So looking for the LD50, the dose at which 50% of the animals die. But you can also look for major organ damage and other kind of gross effects on the body with these tests. There are what are called subchronic tests, which increase the time a little bit from generally around 1 to 3 months, and might include some repeat dosing. So rather than just having one dose of the chemical, they might have more than one dose. And typically you're stepping down your concentrations at this point because you have already a sense of the LD50, and you don't want to be exposing animals long-term to concentrations that already killed them before after a shorter term. So using a more limited range of concentrations, and still ultimately looking for some of these major endpoints like death, organ damage. It can also start to look at effects on reproduction, depending upon the species, which are typically rodents at this stage, although, once again, other species are used. And then there are chronic tests, which are longer term, typically 1 year or more, at least for rodents. It's a repeat dosing, so they're consistently getting exposed to the chemical over time. And once again, typically fewer concentrations, just because this is a longer term test. So it's a lot of, basically work and maintenance to have a bunch of animals for a long time. So it's, fewer concentrations and groups of different animals being exposed. And in addition to those major outcomes that we keep talking about, you can also look for cancer effects in these tests. So cancer typically takes a long time to develop. It doesn't happen immediately after exposure, so you need these longer term tests if you're looking for cancer as an endpoint. And then there are a variety of different targeted tests that can kind of fit into these other tests. The exposure scenario can kind of depend upon what they're integrated into, but there are targeted tests for things like neurotoxicity, immunotoxicity, multi-generation effects. So you can look at more specific things, but this essentially is the range of tests that are done. And just a note here is that they are typically done, most of them with exposure starting in adult animals. And I'm just checking my time, and I think I'm going more slowly than I anticipated. So I am going to just mention that there are limitations to mammalian toxicity tests, but they're, let's see, that I already touched upon. And the main thing that I want to point out here is the sensitive windows of exposure not being included in the testing design oftentimes. So early life exposures are often can be a more sensitive point for later life health outcomes. And they're also typically using like much higher concentrations than what humans are exposed to. And there are alternative approaches that are being developed for mammalian testing that including computer models, in vitro models, and non-mammalian models, which allow for higher speed of testing, as well as higher throughput number of chemicals that you can test at once. They provide their own advantages as to what they can look at, but obviously they have their own limitations, including just needing information to start with to inform some of the computer-based methods. For cell-based tests, you are looking at one cell type in isolation, which is not how cells exist in an organism, and they might respond differently to chemical exposures in that artificial scenario compared to in the organism. And then for non-mammalian organisms, there's obviously physiological differences that might not always translate well into effects that happen onto human-specific organs. So fundamentally, there is no model that can exactly replicate a human. All models are models, and there's going to be limitations to all of them. And then even among humans, there's a lot of variation that can occur to the same chemical exposure due to age or health status, making a person potentially more vulnerable. Individual genetics can vary and can alter how a person responds to a chemical exposure, as well as psychosocial stressors and other social vulnerabilities like experiencing racism or other marginalization in society. And another issue that is important for toxicity toxicity testing in general as to how it's typically done is that chemical co-exposures typically aren't included, and they are difficult to test for because there are so many different chemicals that a person could be exposed to at once. It's hard to know which ones to even test in combination, as well as what concentrations to use for the different chemicals. In addition to the fact that manufacturers are not responsible for testing their chemicals, or other producers' chemicals with their own, they're only responsible for testing theirs. So there's no obligation for producers to consider those co-exposures, nor is it done typically for the most part in the regulatory setting. So I would argue that we're all undergoing toxicity testing. We're exposed to many, many chemicals every day through all sorts of different routes, through the different products that we consume, due to intentional additions, but also unintentional additions. And I haven't talked about it here, but another important point in a separate area of regulation is the waste management issue, or issues of chemicals getting into the environment outside of their intended uses. And as a result, in addition to substances being intentionally added to food, for instance, you can also have chemicals that get taken up into plants and animals due to their chemical exposures, in addition to contaminated water and air getting exposure, or we're being exposed to chemicals that way as well. So we're essentially surrounded by chemicals, and the data that we have from independent researchers, as well as from the major national biomonitoring program under CDC, which is called NHANES, indicates that people, they only test for a certain range of chemicals, but of the ones that they do test for, the ones that are commonly detected in nearly everyone include PFAS, phthalates, which are found in plastics, as well as can be found in cosmetic products, parabens, which are often used as preservatives in cosmetics, BPA, another plastic related material, and triclosan, which is an antimicrobial or antimicrobial agent. And all of these chemicals have independent studies indicating that there may be concerns for human health effects from their exposure, or from our exposure to them. And big picture, there are recent epidemiological studies coming out showing that the rates of cancer incidence, particularly among younger people, are rising globally. And the US in particular has the highest incidence of cancer rates in people aged 15 to 49. We don't know the exact cause for this increase in cancer. We do know that it's genetic shift is not an explanatory factor, just based upon the time frame in which it's happened. And many researchers point to the likelihood of diet or lifestyle impacting our cancer risk, but that to some extent ignores the fact that our diet contains many both intentionally and unintentionally added chemicals, in addition to all the other air pollution, water pollution, and other chemicals that we're exposed to in products. So it's difficult to show that any one chemical exposure or chemical mixture is certainly causing a health effect in humans without direct testing in humans, which obviously we don't really want to do, but essentially we are doing. And epidemiological studies. So these are, essentially studies of looking at people who are exposed just through their daily life, have linked various chemical exposures to health effects like neurodegenerative diseases, metabolic diseases, impacts on reproduction, and a whole host of others. So it seems like what we're doing is not the most health protective approach to chemical management. And in terms of just, even when toxicity testing has been performed, as I mentioned, there are limitations, and it's good to have at least some data to characterize the likely risk. We still don't necessarily 100% know how each chemical is going to affect human health, and it's even harder to know what's going to happen when you have all these different chemicals exposures occurring in combination. So while I would still argue that toxicity testing is important to understand, the likely effects that chemicals might have, ultimately preventing human exposures to chemicals in the first place minimizes the risks of health impacts to the greatest extent. And so I said in my abstract, and I said at the start, that I was going to talk about some pointers for what you can do to minimize your own risk of exposures, as well as potentially helping others as well. So I just wanted to make sure to have time to touch upon that. And I'm apologizing for running longer than I intended. But right, so starting with reducing your own chemical exposures. I didn't go into great detail here in terms of just the types of chemicals that are of greatest concern, or exactly what we know about them, but you can learn about that through resources like the Environmental Working Group's consumer guides. That's pretty comprehensive. And as Tracy mentioned, the Silent Spring website itself has a lot of information with a greater focus on endocrine disrupting chemicals and chemicals that are relevant to breast cancer, but also relevant to lots of other health effects. So there are definitely good resources out there to learn. Once you know a bit about the chemicals that might be of concern, then you can start being more careful to look on, or you can check product labels to identify ones that might be more of a health concern that you might consider avoiding. And there are apps such as the Detox Me app that's through Silent Spring Institute, or another app called Clearia. Plus there are others that can help you to identify products that you might want to avoid. And I just wanted to mention some tips that Silent Spring Institute has for a couple different categories of places in your life where you might minimize harmful chemical exposures. So as I talked about, there's not great regulations on food packaging. So avoiding eating canned food or moist food that's packaged in plastic or lined cardboard is one way to minimize chemical exposures. Canned food linings and plastic packaging has, a lot of various chemicals, but especially BPA or similar chemicals, phthalates, and lined cardboard can have PFAS, as well as basically any other anti-grease lining can have PFAS in it. Aiming to utilize glass or stainless steel instead of plastic in various contexts in your in terms of storing foods, cooking foods, as well as for water. Phasing out nonstick pans from your kitchen because those coatings are often made with PFAS. Choosing organic produce, meat and dairy when possible is a way to minimize your exposure to pesticide residues, since there are a limit. The FDA allows for certain levels of pesticide residues to be on food. So studies have found that typically organic produce does have lower levels of those chemicals because many of them are, or most synthetic chemicals are explicitly not allowed in the use of organic production. And then for cleaning products, in our household, a lot of chemicals that kind of shed off of the various products we have can accumulate in household dust. So essentially dust is itself like a source of that can harbor chemicals that have come from various places. So when you are cleaning dusty places, utilizing a HEPA filter for your vacuum, or just wiping with a damp cloth to minimize how much is getting up into the air and potentially, preventing you from inhaling those the dust particles that have chemicals bound to them potentially. And then just utilizing products that are made with simpler ingredients, even making your own products, choosing fragrance-free products, because fragrances there are thousands of fragrance chemicals, and once again, not well characterized. So just minimizing fragrances, since they're not necessary for the cleaning process, is a way to help. And then obviously, if you see signs for poisons, that's something that you might want to avoid as well. And then finally, some tips for personal care products, avoiding chemicals that are labeled as having parabens, phthalates, and fragrances, or rather, they may be labeled as being paraben or phthalate or fragrance free, because you don't always things aren't always contained in the labels, unfortunately. But trying to avoid products with these chemicals, again, trying to avoid products that have triclosan or trichlocarbon, avoiding waterproof cosmetics, since once again, those can contain PFAS, and to the extent possible, minimizing just the number of products that you use. If there are products that you can go without, that might be a decent option, because there are studies indicating that the more products that people use, the greater the likelihood or the higher levels of certain chemicals that they're exposed to. So that's one option. And then wrapping up there, let decision makers know if you are concerned about the status of chemical regulation or how chemicals are dealt with in the US. Let your federal representatives know in terms of the federal law, which is what federal law and regulations are what I was focusing on in this talk, but states may also have some authority to regulate or restrict in instances. So also anywhere you can, contacting decision makers, government decision makers, but also letting chemical manufacturers know if you're concerned about chemicals that are in their products, or maybe if you stopped using a product of theirs because you saw that it contained chemicals that pose a health risk, then let them know, because obviously they don't want to lose business, and they might be incentivized to change their formulation and ultimately protect more people. And yeah, that brings me to the final point of working with others. So there are many national and local groups that are specifically working on strengthening chemical laws and regulations, and NRDC, EDF, Toxic Free Future are just some of them, but there's lots out there. So getting involved with those groups, or seeing what you can do there is one option. You can start your own community group, especially if you're in a community that is affected by chemical manufacturers. And then also just sharing resources with friends and family. People aren't often aware of these issues. They're not necessarily on people's radar. So the more you can let other people know, the more momentum can pick up for changes to be made. And at that, I'm just going to summarize a few key takeaways so we can have at least a few minutes left for questions. But once again, we have thousands of chemicals that we can be exposed to every day, and many of these don't have any data on health effects, or there are data that are later produced that indicate there are health effects, but they're still not restricted. And this is perfectly legal under our current system in many cases. It is possible, but I would argue unlikely, that all of these chemicals are completely harmless to humans. We're creating all kinds of new chemicals that have never existed in the world before, that our bodies have never encountered before. And the likelihood that they're doing absolutely nothing, to me, seems very low. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but that the likelihood that all of these chemicals with no data are entirely harmless seems not very plausible to me. And then we can use toxicity testing to help characterize chemicals that have pose the greatest risk, and to try to strategize which ones maybe should be restricted or not used in certain products. Essentially, they're still limited, and we're ultimately exposed to chemicals, and there are increasing rates of cancer and chronic diseases that suggest that these chemicals might be affecting our health. And essentially the most proactive health protective approach, I would argue, is essentially reducing the number of chemicals that people are exposed to in the first place, and stopping the vast chemical production at the scale that we have, and limiting what people can be exposed to in the first place. And I will just leave it at that with a quote from Rachel Carson. And thanks all so much for being here. Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much, Abigail. Really great. Yeah, I like this last quote. I was gonna ask you at one point. Well, the good news is we're not all dropping dead. So that's the good news.
I mean, that's an argument to be made for everything being fine. That's one level of fine. Yeah.
The questions, it's, if you'd gone only 10 minutes, we still wouldn't get through all the questions. There were so many questions.
I'm so sorry.
I'll parse out some of them. They fall, as they often do, into two groups. One group is sort of the outrage. What can we do about this? How can we help? And you gave some good pointers there. And then there's the individual level. What can I do? What about this? What about, how do I do this? So let's go to the individual level to start with. And I won't spend too much time there, but some people asked before the seminar, and they're asking in the Q&A now, who do I trust? What is a trustworthy source of knowing what chemicals are in things? As an example, you see canned foods, you say, we should avoid canned foods. Most of us that are toxicologists know that, but so many cans are labeled BPA free. Does that mean they're safe? And I'll just throw that to you right there.
Right. So yeah, I think there's, okay. So yeah, there's a lot of room in product labeling for, I would argue, perhaps misleading claims or just incomplete claims. There are certain labels that have real meaning, like the USDA organic standard has an official law as to what that means, and there are processes for enforcing that. Many other claims on product labels don't necessarily have rigid requirements or enforcement. So when you see something like BPA free, okay, that's good. It could have BPF or BPS or a similar chemical, and there's this whole chemical replacement conveyor belt issue. That's another thing. But essentially, right, just looking for labels, is not always reliable. So what can you do? It's a hard question. I personally, my view is that independent scientists who have missions for being public health focused are perhaps ones who are reliable for providing information that is protective of public health. But obviously that is my own bias. And, I think there are some people working in regulatory agencies that, obviously care about these issues, but there's others who don't necessarily and are more aligned with interests, or just their priorities are more in terms of commerce or, financial. So I think once again, it's, trying to just minimize those places where you can encounter chemicals. I know this is not the most useful response for many people. It's hard to change your life, or what else do you do? But it's to me, it's minimization, because there's no elimination for the most part. That's entirely in your control.
Okay, I mean I think we sort of know that it's tough. But you mentioned the Environmental Defense Fund as one of the sources of good information. If you had to list a couple, 2 or 3 organizations that are working to help people understand how to minimize their personal risks, what would those top 2 or 3 be?
Yeah, I think, like I mentioned before, I in the past and still, go to Environmental Working Group has a lot of just different kind of guides on different classes of chemicals and where they're used. Silent Spring Institute does have information that tends to be a little bit more limited to focus on what are classed as endocrine disrupting chemicals, but it's still, very good information. It's just a little bit of a narrower focus. And then, the Toxic Free Future also has some guides as well. But there's definitely resources out there.
Yeah, one person put in an anecdote that they had done some looking into cleaning products. They were looking up from the EPA saying what are safer cleaning products.
Right.
I don't know what it was, but it was very caustic and it hurt to breathe. And I just, basically people wonder who they can trust.
So EPA does have that Safer Chemicals program, which I don't know that much about in detail, but I have recently a little bit just looked at the, program, to me, that it's not super transparent as to exactly what the requirements are for including chemicals on that list. I don't find that to be the most meaningful list to me personally, unfortunately. But yeah, it's hard to know without having expert judgment or not, like having education in this area, as to what is reasonable or not. It's tough.
Well, sort of going to a middle ground. So going from the individual's concern, that we had one question from a person who runs basically is a brewer, and I think it was brewer, maybe a distiller. And they were saying, are there resources for small businesses to try to better understand their supply chain and whether or not their supply chain and the materials they're using in their creation of products is as safe as possible?
That is a great question. Not something that I have deep knowledge of. I believe that there are programs specifically in California for certain supply chains and certain products. I'm not aware of specifically anything for brewers other than, one thing to just think about is the water source that you're using. I'm sure, I'm sure that's being considered, but just in terms of if, obviously that's a large part of the product. So just thinking about that as a starting place. But yeah, I wish I had that off the top of my head, but unfortunately I do not.
So we're in the last couple of minutes moving back out to the bigger picture. Again, many of the questions and my reactions too, as you were talking about the system of regulatory structure that we have in this country, it's somewhat of a sense of outrage that food additives are not having to be required to be tested for toxicity before they're put into our food. So some people have commented, what we really need is one agency, one entity needs to be in charge of safety of chemicals. And I'm not going to ask you what are the prospects for doing that in the US, because I think they're very dim and it would take forever. Are you aware of any other countries other countries where they have more of a centralized approach to assessing toxicity of chemicals? I'm just curious. People often say, look to Europe, but I'm broadening it to the entire globe. Are there other countries that are doing what we think is maybe a better job than we are? Obviously, the cancer data would suggest though.
Yeah, I know the most about Europe just because I did my master's program there, and I think that to the best of my knowledge, they do tend to have some of the most protective regulations, though still imperfect as well. So under the REACH regulation, there are requirements for one of the main things that is important is the re-registration of products periodically. So that is something that's required. And granted, there's still potentially, there's still problems with it. It's not perfect. But just the fact that you do have to regularly review and kind of show new data and just assure that, the best available information indicates the product's still okay to use as it's being used is one thing. I think the idea of having more centralized or thinking about chemicals more broadly, granted, the systems to some extent make sense because there's different uses and different ways that we're likely exposed. But at the same time, many chemicals just end up in the environment anyway, and we get exposed through ambient exposures regardless. So having a more comprehensive way or that regulation happens for all chemicals regardless of their intended use, to me would be a good idea. And as well as incorporating not just how it's intended to be used during manufacturing, but then bringing that kind of life cycle picture in. So obviously EPA does regulate stuff on the further downstream end, but putting it all together.
So I'll just close by saying that we're out of time, but we will send out thank you to everybody that attended. They may have some questions they may want to send to you. And when we send that out, we'll also ask for some links from you that we could put in there for people to get more information. Again, thanks so very much. Wish we had more time, but it was very informative. And again, just thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Ciao.